climb across through a whiteout storm completely alone. At least, that is how the expedition had begun. He became aware of something impossible beside him. Another presence. Not behind him. Not somewhere in the distance. Walking beside him. Keeping pace with every step. And strangely, he did not feel afraid. Years later, after surviving the mountain, he described the experience publicly. Then others began reporting the same thing. Not in one country, not in one expedition, but across mountains, oceans, disasters, and frozen wastelands all over the world. People approaching the edge of survival, repeatedly claiming they were no longer alone. There are places on Earth where human beings were never meant to remain for long. Frozen oceans, collapsed mountains, endless storms, regions so isolated that the mind itself begins to lose its ordinary sense of proportion. And yet throughout history, people have continued crossing them. Explorers, climbers, sailors, survivors. Many returned carrying stories of starvation, exhaustion, and exposure. But some returned describing something else entirely, not a creature, not an apparition, not even something they could fully see. Only the overwhelming certainty that at the edge of isolation, another presence had appeared beside them. A companion, calm, silent, and impossibly real. The phenomenon would eventually become known as the third man factor, but decades after the first recorded accounts emerged, no one has ever fully explained why so many people, separated by time, geography, and circumstance, continued describing almost the same experience. Extreme isolation alters the human mind in ways that are still not fully understood. Long before the phenomenon was ever formally discussed, explorers had already documented the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to hostile environments. Sleep deprivation, starvation, hypothermia, sensory monotony, weeks spent surrounded by landscapes so empty and repetitive that ordinary perception itself began to change. Modern expedition researchers would later observe similar effects among mountaineers, polar crews, sailors, and individuals pushed beyond normal physical limits. Time distortion, emotional detachment, memory instability, depersonalization. Under extreme conditions, even the boundary between the self and the surrounding environment could begin to weaken. And yet the reports associated with the third man factor often differed from ordinary hallucinations in one important way. Many accounts described experiences that felt unusually calm and coherent compared to the ordinary stress hallucinations. Rarely violent, and rarely described as frightening in the moment they occurred. Instead, survivors repeatedly described the same unsettling pattern. A calm presence nearby, close enough to feel, sometimes walking beside them, sometimes speaking, sometimes guiding them forward, step by step, through conditions they no longer believed they could survive alone. For many of them, the experience felt less like seeing something impossible and more like realizing someone had been there the entire time. In 1914, explorer Ernest Shackleton and the crew of the Endurance departed for Antarctica with the intention of completing the first land crossing of the continent. They never reached it. Before the expedition could even begin its crossing, the Endurance became trapped in Antarctic pack ice. For months, the ship drifted helplessly through the frozen sea while pressure from the surrounding ice slowly began crushing the vessel apart. Eventually, the crew was forced to abandon the ship entirely. What followed became one of the most brutal survival journeys in exploration history. The men crossed moving ice fields on foot, dragging lifeboats across frozen terrain, survived exposure, starvation, exhaustion, and near total isolation from the rest of the world. Months later, Shackleton and two members of his crew, Frank Worsley and Tom Crean, attempted one final crossing across the unmapped mountains of the South Georgia island in order to reach a whaling station and organize rescue for the remaining men. The crossing was carried out almost entirely without sleep. The terrain was unknown. The temperatures were lethal. And the three men were already physically collapsing long before the journey was finished. Years later, while describing the expedition publicly, Shackleton recalled something strange that had accompanied them during the crossing. Not a sound, not a figure emerging from the snow, only the overwhelming sensation that another individual had been walking beside them through the mountains, as though a fourth member of the group had somehow joined the crossing, unnoticed. Shackleton would later write, "It seemed to me often that we were four, not three." At first the statements appeared almost metaphorical, a psychological response to exhaustion and isolation. But years later, both Worsley and Crean separately admitted experiencing the same sensation during the crossing, not independently hallucinating different things, but describing the same impossible feeling that someone else had been there with them in the mountains. At first, the account from South Georgia remained little more than an unusual detail buried inside a larger survival story. But Shackleton's expedition would not remain unique for long. Over the decades that followed, remarkably similar experiences continued appearing in reports from climbers, sailors, aviators, and survivors exposed to extreme isolation. In 1933, British mountaineer Frank Smythe attempted a solo ascent of Mount Everest. The climb pushed him into severe exhaustion and oxygen deprivation high above the mountain. Later, Smythe described becoming convinced that another climber was accompanying him during the ascent. The sensation became so convincing that at one point, he reportedly removed a piece of cake from his pocket and attempted to share it with the unseen companion beside him. Years later, climber Joe Simpson described something equally difficult to explain. After suffering catastrophic injuries while trapped alone in the Peruvian Andes, weak, freezing, and barely able to continue moving. Simpson later recalled hearing a calm, internal voice guiding him step by step towards survival. The voice was not emotional. It did not panic. If anything, it sounded detached, procedural, almost as though another part of his mind had separated itself from fear entirely. During a solo voyage around the world, sailor Joshua Slocum later described sensing the presence of an unseen companion aboard the vessel during periods of severe exhaustion and illness at sea. Like many of the accounts before it, the experience was not described as frightening, only strangely real. Even aviator Charles Lindbergh later described experiencing phantom companions during prolonged solo flights. Different environments, different decades, different people with no connections to one another. And yet, the descriptions repeatedly return to the same impossible idea that at the edge of survival, human beings stopped feeling alone. As the reports continued accumulating, researchers gradually began examining the phenomenon through fields of survival psychology, neurology, and expedition research. One of the most widely discussed explanations centered around the effects of prolonged isolation on the brain itself. Under ordinary conditions, human beings constantly reinforce their sense of identity through interaction, conversation, movement, environmental variation, other people. But in extreme survival environments, many of those reference points disappear simultaneously. The landscape becomes repetitive. Time loses structure. Sleep deteriorates. The body weakens. And slowly, the boundaries separating the self from the surrounding environment can begin destabilizing. Some researchers propose that under these conditions, the brain may externalize part of its own cognitive processes as a survival mechanism. One part of the mind continuing to experience exhaustion and fear, while another separates itself from emotional collapse in order to preserve focus and movement. Some expedition researchers also suggested that human beings appear profoundly dependent upon social orientation. Even in solitude, the brain continuously expects the presence of others. And under extreme isolation, some scientists believe the mind may begin generating companionship internally when external companionship disappears completely. But even researchers supporting these explanations acknowledge an uncomfortable reality. The theories explained how such experiences might occur, but not necessarily why they appeared so emotionally similar across unrelated individuals separated by time, geography, and circumstance. Despite the growing number of reports, the third man factor has never been universally accepted as a distinct phenomenon. For many researchers, the experiences remained explainable through known psychological and neurological effects associated with extreme stress, exhaustion, hypoxia, sleep deprivation, starvation, sensory monotony. All of these conditions are capable of altering perception in profound ways. And unlike physical evidence, nearly all reports connected to the phenomenon depended entirely upon testimony, personal recollection, private journals, expedition accounts reconstructed years after the events themselves had ended. Critics argued that this created a serious problem. Once famous accounts like the Shackletons became widely known, later survivors may have unconsciously interpreted their own experiences through an already existing narrative. Others proposed that the experiences reflected ordinary survival hallucinations, later reshaped into meaningful stories through memory and repetition. And in many cases, there was simply no way to verify what survivors believed they had experienced while physically exhausted and psychologically strained. But even among skeptics, one detail remained difficult to dismiss entirely: the consistency. Again and again, unrelated individuals described experiences following remarkably similar emotional structures, not random visions, not chaotic delusions, but calm companionship, guidance, presence. No explanation fully removed the phenomenon, but no testimony ever fully proved it either. For many survivors, the most disturbing part of the experience was not what they saw, it was what they felt afterward. The certainty, long after the storms had passed, long after the expedition ended, many remained unable to fully dismiss the feeling that someone had truly been there beside them, not imagined, not symbolic, but present. The phenomenon appeared where human beings became separated from nearly everything familiar, an exhaustion so complete that ordinary perception itself began breaking apart beneath it. Most people will never experience conditions severe enough to encounter anything like this, but the reports remain. Again and again, survivors standing at the edge of collapse continued describing the same impossible comfort, another presence beside them, waiting for them to continue moving. The third man factor has never been fully explained. Perhaps it never will be. But across more than a century of recorded survival accounts, one detail continued resurfacing with unsettling consistency. Not stories of monsters, not visions of violence, only the repeated sensation at the edge of survival. Another presence had appeared beside them, sometimes speaking, sometimes guiding, sometimes simply remaining there in the silence where the individual continued forward through conditions they no longer believed they could survive alone. Whether the phenomenon emerged from survival instinct, fractured cognition, neurological adaptation, or something still beyond explanation, remains unresolved, but the pattern survived. Again and again, people pushed beyond the limits of exhaustion and isolation, and they described the same impossible realization. that somewhere between collapse and survival, they had stopped being alone. The record remembers.